Welcome back to Energetically You. I'm your host, Megan Swan, the creator of the Sustainable Integrated Wellness Approach. Today, I have a very special interview. I have invited Kathryn Bruni-Young. She is the daughter of one of my most beloved influences and teachers, and she is a powerhouse in the yoga world in her own right. And one thing that I love about her is how she's always forged her own path and gone against the grain and really brought some new influences to the yoga world and her practice and her trainings. So I will briefly read to you that a little bit more about Kathryn. She is the founder of Mindful Strength and the host of her own podcast called Mindful Strength Podcast. She is an international yoga and movement teacher. Her work helps everyday people build strength and confidence from home with online classes and trainings. She also provides education for yoga teachers and clinicians who want to bring more strength into their classes and in turn into their clients. So I am so excited, honestly, a little bit nervous. She's been a big influence in my life, and I really respect her work. And I'm so thrilled that she's agreed to this interview. So I will, with no further ado, hit pause and we'll jump right in with Kathryn. Hi, Kathryn, and welcome to Energetically You. I'm really so honored and thrilled to have you here today, and so excited about our conversation. So can you open with just telling my audience a little bit about your journey, and then later we can maybe get into the ins and outs of how long we've known each other and all the ebbs and flows that go along with that. So what are you doing and what is your passion these days?
Yeah, for sure. So I started practicing yoga and different types of movement, including dance and gymnastics when I was a little kid. And as you know, but the listeners might not know, my mom started one of the first studios in Canada. And so I started doing yoga with her at the studio when I was young. And then over the years through high school, I got more and more into that. I was unsure of what I wanted to do after high school. So I started working at the studio a little bit and doing more teacher trainings and working on my own practice and my own teaching. And that basically just, continued and snowballed over the years until now. Now my teaching is really different from the way it was when I first got started. I have moved more into strength training and mobility and functional movement, and teaching people mostly online, especially for the last year and a half while we have been in this very intense lockdown here in Canada. But it's been just so interesting, preparing for this interview today, looking back on how I got started and what I'm doing now seems so different. But it really has been this gradual progression of starting someplace, experiencing that, learning a little bit more, changing what I'm doing, continuing to learn more, continuing to change what I'm doing over the years now at this place.
Yeah, well, I was also reflecting back. I'm pretty sure there was a few classes. I can specifically remember one class that you did in that smaller studio in Downward Dog. I feel like you were subbing for someone, but it was one of those beginner classes. And it was one of the most intense classes of my life. I feel that was always your zone of genius, is getting people to drill down on the strength required to move on or to do it at a faster pace. And I always saw you as sort of pushing the limits of what was allowed within the dogma of Ashtanga yoga at that time when you were, well, I don't know, was that 15 years ago now? A while ago.
Yeah.
And then you like really broke out and started doing your own thing, which I so loved and respected. So can you tell us about your transition there and what was your process?
Yeah. Oh my goodness. What you said about pushing the boundaries of what was okay and acceptable within that community at that point. Yeah. When I look back, I realized that really was what was happening, even though in those moments, it didn't feel like I was rebelling so much. It just felt like, oh, this is this like natural progression of what I'm interested now. So of course I'm going to start doing this new stuff now in my classes. But yeah, as I look back, I definitely realized like, wow, that was actually really different. And not a lot of other people were pushing up against that style of practice in that way. So when I was in my early 20s, again, like I started teaching when I was a teenager. So by the time I was like 21, 22, I had already been practicing and teaching for a handful of years. So I had all of that experience already. And in my early 20s, I remember I went to do a 1-month teacher training program in Colorado with a really famous teacher who I had been practicing with. My mom had been practicing with for years as well. And that was the last real yoga training that I ever did. And I remember coming home from that training, and then we had a friend over one night and he was telling me about this other type of movement with this like gym teacher and gymnastics coach. And I was like, oh, maybe that's interesting. And then I really just stumbled into the gym one day, like on a whim, like, okay, I'll go take this class. Let me go see what this is all about. And it was in that first workshop in the gym that I really started to realize, oh my goodness, I've been training my body and teaching other people to train their body in such a specific way that actually is not helpful for everyone all the time for the rest of their lives. And there's so many other things that I could be incorporating to make this practice more accessible, more fun, more balanced, more well-rounded. And that was really the beginning. So after that initial workshop, I was like, oh my goodness, I think I need to be doing some of these other exercises myself. And then, a few weeks goes by, and then I start to realize I should really be doing these types of exercises in my classes, because I think these would help a lot of other people. But again, at that point, I was teaching in this Ashtanga studio where there were no like hybrid classes. There were no like yoga with strength or yoga with mobility. It was just like mostly just Ashtanga or Vinyasa yoga. It felt like our studio was not a very strict studio, but as I look back now, I realize, wow, we were actually very, very strict in the way that we were practicing. The yoga community, the yoga studio scene is very different now than it was back then. Mm-hmm. And so I just started teaching some new exercises in my classes, and just really a little bit at a time. So I didn't change a lot. So people were not like really unpleasantly surprised.
Yeah, I feel like you integrated it very little by little, no? Like it was kind of still dressed up as yoga so that nobody would freak out.
Totally. And I think was also why I was successful in doing that. So I just started putting new little things in there, and then one thing led to another. And then, a year later, my class started to look really different. It started to turn into like more strengthening, less of the yoga poses. And then that just snowballed and progressed basically over the next number of years. That was 8 years ago. So as the years have gone on, I've definitely been teaching more and more and more strengthening practices, strength training, but still in a way that almost feels like a yoga class. So not like in a gym fitnessy, like I'm going to like put on loud music and yell at you kind of way, more in a way that's like a little bit slower, a little bit more of a calm atmosphere, even though, as you're mentioning, the exercises can be quite physically demanding and progressive.
Yeah. your classes are amazing. And so first of all, like, congratulations on being ahead of the curve, being in the online space. I feel like it seemed really strange, that move, what you made. I don't know how many years ago it was now, but to move to a small town and, focus on quality online product, way ahead of the curve, right? So you were perfectly set up for arguably the pandemic. So who are you attracting now in terms of clients? Is it more, I'm guessing you have different styles of classes for people that are really designed for other yoga teachers versus, I don't know, maybe you have people like recovering from injuries, or is it just kind of like regular people that want a daily practice?
Yeah. So in my membership, which is like my online studio, which is, not everything that I do, but it's a lot of what I do at this point, we have such a diverse group of students. So it's people from all over the world, practicing from all different time zones. It's people aged, 25 to 70 or 75. So we have a pretty diverse age group. It is a lot of yoga teachers. I would say it's about half and half of yoga teachers, and then just other people who are looking for a movement practice that's going to help them feel stronger, but it's not a real fitnessy, kind of like aggressive, fast-paced feel. It's really, it's been so interesting watching how my own teaching has had to shift in order to be accessible for more people. Because when I was living in Toronto and teaching a downward dog at that studio that I grew up in, I was teaching a lot of classes a week, but to a very, very specific audience. That studio had a reputation of being very physically intense. So that would self-select, only a certain type of person would actually end up in my classes in that studio. And so that meant that I could just teach in a really specific way. But then 6 years ago, when I left the city and moved out here to a much smaller city with people who didn't have a lot of experience with asana practice, strengthening, anything like that, then my teaching really had to shift. And I had to figure out how to teach people who were truly new and who didn't have this huge background that I was used to. And I had to really learn how to make my teaching more accessible. And that was such a great process to have to go through as a teacher, because then as soon as I started putting my classes online, which was shortly after I moved out here, more and more people were able to join those classes. It wasn't just 35-year-olds who were really into Ashtanga. It was like people from all over who were taking the classes at all different times of day, many different ages. And it really just showed me how much my teaching had to grow in order to be able to reach more people.
Yeah, I had a similar experience moving to this small town in Mexico where in the beginning, like, I was literally one of a handful of teachers. And most people were absolute beginners. Like, there was the odd person that maybe in another city had been to like hardcore Ashtanga classes, but most people, and just to appreciate like what a basic class would have been in downward dog is not that accessible to the average person. And certainly someone who's totally out of shape, those kind of classes, you need to have a whole other approach and appreciation for where people are at. And also not look at it like, well, I was also going to say, a lot of people, at least where I live here, have this idea that yoga is this like soft, relaxing, not intense necessarily thing. And so they would come to my classes, which I'd like to think were still much more accessible than they had been in previous years, but it would oftentimes like kind of scare them off because they had no concept that they'd be sweating, kind of thing. And I feel like you always impress me with your classes that wouldn't necessarily need to be fluidity and a lot of intense movement. It was more, the intensity was in the pause and in the focus.
Yeah. Yeah. 100%. I think that people sometimes have that idea about yoga classes, but even more than that, I think that people have those ideas about any type of practice that is considered mindful. So oftentimes, if you like meet someone on the street and you ask them what mindful movement is, they're going to think of like meditation or something slow or gentle or Tai Chi or something like that. And I think that we've been kind of like misunderstanding what mindful means and thinking that it needs to be slow, calm, gentle. We need to be in a relaxing place. We need to be in a relaxing state where, I think mindful practices are preparing us for life, and life is not always slow and gentle and calm and relaxed. And so I think that in starting to train ourselves to be able to do things that are, fast, hard, chaotic, dynamic, we are engaging in the mindful movement practice in a different way that's going to really help prepare us for what we're going to come up against in daily life when the stressors and the things will inevitably happen. And if we're only able to channel our minds when things are slow, calm, relaxed, then I'm not sure that those practices are actually preparing us for what's going to happen in our lives. And then, that being said, obviously these practices need to meet people where they are. So I'm not saying that everyone needs to start with something that's like chaotic and dynamic and really hard, but gradually over time, people can progress. And I think that especially the type of people I work with, they don't really understand how adaptive their bodies actually are and how strong and resilient they can actually become with some really good progressive training. And so then they're often surprised by how strong they've been able to become or how confident they've become in movements and in daily life. And I think that's just, kind of like the silver lining to all of this.
Yeah, I love that you said all that about the different concepts of mindfulness. And I do want to, in fact, why don't we end off go a deep dive on confidence, because I think that's like one of the most important aspects of your work. But I wanted to back up and talk about the fact that half of your students are yoga teachers. And I'm guessing it's because they've had some awareness somewhere along the line of the need to include different types of movements into the practice. I know I've had this repetitive chaturanga injury, or like basically if I only do chaturanga, I have pain on the back of one shoulder blade. But when I, incorporate other types of push-ups into my practice or just do other strength training exercises, I'm totally fine. So I wanted to talk about, basically a topic that your mom sort of blew the lid off, or she was definitely one of the major people that started to speak out about this on a bigger level, that yoga, there's a such thing as yoga injuries, and as much as it can be a conscious practice, there needs to be awareness about its downfalls, or basically if someone comes into a class and is doing fast, repetitive movements and they don't have the strength and the awareness to back it up, sort of the preamble, if you will, which I feel like is your zone of genius, then it can be really dangerous for people to be in these classes.
Yeah. So I think, when I was learning the Ashtanga practice, it was sold to me as, this is the practice you should do. It's fully balanced. This is what you need to do in order to be healthy. And I was like, okay, great. I can just do this practice like 5 times a week. And that's what I need to do. Okay, perfect. And then about 5 years into that, like you, I started to have some issues, not with my shoulder, with other parts of my body, with my knees, with my back. And I would go to my yoga teachers and they would be like, okay, well, let's just modify this. Let's just make it easier for you. and let's like, don't go so far. You're pushing yourself too hard. You're going too deep, pull back, always about the pulling back, because they were afraid and they didn't know. They didn't really know what else to say. Because they hadn't learned a lot about exercise physiology or pain science or biomechanics, right? All they knew was these poses and like a certain type of philosophy to go with it. And that's what I did for probably another couple of years, pulling back, modifying all the time. Then I started going to the gym, and my first personal trainer, his attitude was completely the opposite. He's like, okay, your back hurts. Let's strengthen that part of you. Let's load that up. Okay, your knees hurt. Let's load them up. Let's give your body the stimulus it needs to build the strength and to build the capacity that these parts of your body need if you want to be able to do this practice that you're doing or any other practice, physical movement. And that was a really big eye opener for me, because that's when I started to realize that Ashtanga practice that I had been doing for so long was not balanced. Mm-hmm. And that's when I also, at first I was like, oh my God, this practice, this is so bad. This chaturanga is going to ruin people's shoulders. These pigeon poses are going to ruin people's hips. Like we all kind of like go through that for a little while. My mom definitely went through that for a few years. We all did. And then on the other side of that, learning more about adaptation and how the body works, we started to realize, wait a second, it's not these poses' fault. It's that these poses are just not balanced. And oftentimes one form of movement is not perfectly balanced. But when you're sold the idea that one type of movement is going to keep you happy and healthy for the rest of your life, that's when I think people start to run into problems. So I think your experience of the shoulder and the chaturanga is super common. So many of my students come to the practice with these types of experience. I think this is also, like you said, why I attract so many teachers as well, because people are realizing, okay, this idea we were sold on isn't quite how it actually is. And so rather than like freaking people out, but also always trying to modify and pull people back and make it easier for them, what if we can teach them how to build strength so that if they want to do these million chaturangas, they can, and it's not actually going to be a problem. Or if they want to go and do other types of movement with their life, or just feel stronger overall and more resilient, they can also do that. And it's taken our community so long to get to this point where it's totally acceptable to like do pulls with a resistance band in a vinyasa class. Like it's just totally normal now, which is amazing. But when I started this and when you started, this was not totally normal. And so a lot of us had a lot of problems. And I think that as the yoga teacher community and perspective is really changing and becoming more inclusive of different methodologies and types of exercises and the types of props that we can have in our spaces where we're teaching, I think less and less people are going to have these problems because the type of movement that we're teaching now is more well-rounded. And it's not sold with this idea, or at least I hope it's not, that this is all you need to do. Just follow my specific instructions and you'll be happy and healthy forever. I think that everyone is just flexing their critical thinking muscles in a different way. And I think it's really pushing this industry forwards to a new place.
Yeah, I like to think that your mom had a big part of that, at least in the Canadian space, and really. So I wanted to, like, my experience was I found downward dog and quickly your mom and the whole, and getting into the teacher training, and like Ashtanga yoga really was an important shift in my life. And I really kind of delved in to the dogma, because at the time that's what I needed. Like, it was comforting to have this new certainty about this thing that was making me feel better emotionally, physically, and spiritually, arguably for the first time, giving me any sense of spirituality. And then I came to realize these other things. And of course, your mom was a big part of, drawing even more attention to these issues and also presenting solutions similar to yourself. So, but I kind of had this like emotional dance for a while of like, am I yogi? Like, am I, where can I find this space of in between, if you will, or just like, without feeling like I need to forge my own new practice. For you, has there ever been this sort of need to define yourself or pull out of said community? I don't know what I'm trying to say exactly, but for me, I have come back around where I appreciate so much yoga as a tool and that it needs to be integrated into other things and that everybody's different. Like maybe for some people, a really well-rounded integrated practice can be like their main wellness tool. But for me, it's become, post having children, my body's completely different. Post a lot of things, I remember learning in a teacher training that running, supposedly from the yogic perspective, running is only for horses, right? And like running has become a huge part of my life, and has felt like the boy you're talking about, most people doubting, what they're capable of with consistent training. It blew my mind that I managed to train for a half marathon in 13 weeks. Like my girlfriend, you're like, oh, you can do it in 13 weeks. And I know that like years of doing thousands of vinyasas certainly helped my endurance and all that. Like it wasn't just out of nothing, but it also was like a completely different thing. And I found different sense of empowerment. And to me, it's just like yoga has become like one tool that I use, not only in my business and with clients, but also personally. And I haven't felt the need. Well, I will say like, I'm still kind of hesitant to go back to a world. Maybe they don't exist anymore. Like I say, I sort of exist in a bubble here in a small town in Mexico, but I'm sure I would feel out of place if I was in like one of those classes that I used to be arguably addicted to. I used to do back-to-back classes Saturday and Sunday at Downward Dog. I'm not even sure I could do one of those classes anymore. I'll put it at that. So I'll let you share your experience if you've had any of the push and pull of needing to define your place in the yoga community.
Yeah, I think there's always going to be a little bit of that. I think the interesting thing about my work is that whether or not I identify as a yoga teacher, half of my students are yoga teachers. And, the other half who aren't teachers, I know that most of them are coming to my work now, having done some type of asana practice in the past. And because of that, I think my work will always pull from that foundation of knowledge that I was originally taught with the Ashtanga practice. Mm-hmm. I think that the more and more I learn about what yoga actually is, not this type of yoga that's designed for Western women, that's taught in our part of the world, that's also like kind of based on like capitalism and patriarchy. Like, I'm not sure that the style of yoga I was originally trained in is actually yoga. So that also like presents some difficulties in like what am I actually identifying with here? When I first started going to the gym, I had this coach and he was just a strength coach. And I felt that he taught me, obviously, strength training, but with this new type of philosophy that I feel like was more in line with what yoga really is, often than I was taught actually in my Ashtanga studio. So when I start to have that relationship with my new coach, I was just like, whoa, like, what is yoga? And am I really teaching yoga? Or is it this bigger thing that actually has nothing to do with these movements and poses? And then the more I get into that, the more I realize that these poses are not what's making the yoga. You know, these poses were invented by someone with a certain idea about what the body is or how it should move and who should do it. And I've been teaching these poses, but the more and more people I talk to about yoga, the more I realize that it's more of a mindset and a philosophy and a way of being in the world, and not so much the actual exercises. And I think that as a community, as we're learning more about what yoga really is from different types of teachers, from different backgrounds, we're becoming more accepting of what we can teach in those classes. And we're realizing that actually, like, diversity here is good, and like meeting people where they are is good, and balance and, you know, capacity and resilience and all of these things, I think are what is the yoga. But like, doing these set series of poses is not the yoga. But for so many years, I felt like I had to do this set series of poses. And so when I left the studio, when I left Downward Dog and I moved out here, I had a chance to really start fresh, because nobody knew me and they didn't know my mom and they didn't have any expectations. And so I started a little studio and I named it Cornwall Yoga Studio. And I taught with this philosophy that I had learned a lot from my coach. And the more I learned about mindfulness and community, I taught from that perspective, but I really started to teach whatever exercises I wanted. And people would come up to me after class and be like, "You're calling this a yoga studio, but this doesn't feel like the yoga that I do at that other studio." And I would just be like, yeah, this is just kind of a little bit different. And there were always, you know, over the years, there have been these like identity moments of like, actually, what is this that I'm teaching? But like you know, I definitely have an appreciation for some of those philosophies and mindfulness. And I don't think that those things need to be tied to a certain grouping of movements that like one guy made up.
Yeah, I think for me, a huge shift was understanding like my role as a teacher is more of a guide, similar to, you know, my coaching. A good coach helps your student or your client find it in themselves and find that inner knowing. And let's go back now to confidence. Instead of this, like the yoga teacher is some sort of authority that knows something about bodies that you don't know, that has all the answers, that kind of dynamic that I think was, you know, like you say, very patriarchal and supposedly started back in India. I think it's like a whole other conversation about the real history of yoga and the disconnections. But I think being more of a guide and helping people and find that communication and relationship, that listening with their body, and in turn enabling them to find that inner strength, both physically and in terms of a sense of confidence. So can you talk about how that works or, you know, how do you think of confidence?
Yeah, this is something that I've been thinking about so much lately, especially since I've moved out here and I've started teaching classes that were pretty much all levels. And people would come in and they'd do the class. And then a few weeks later, oftentimes people would stay after class and tell me about an experience they've had in their daily life where they felt like, because we've been doing these exercises in classes, they've built up this type of capacity. And now they're having more confidence in their life when they like trip on the sidewalk or pick something up heavy, or they have to go down on the floor with their grandchildren or whatever it is. And I think that the strength training practice helps people with so many things. Like if you look up the benefits of strength training, you're going to see like bone mass and muscle mass and whatever, heart disease, like great, all of those great benefits. But I think one of the biggest benefits of these practices is the confidence that people have, because I think when people start to gain confidence, they start to sign up for different things. They just start to feel that they have the capacity to do different things in their life. And that could be very small things. Like I had a student who had back pain for 20 years. And then after a few months of coming to my classes, she told me one day after class that morning she woke up early and she vacuumed her house before she came to class. And she felt like that was such a huge deal for her because she hadn't been able to do that in years. And that had given her the confidence to like, maybe see what else she could do around her house or around her life. And I don't think it needs to be these like big, huge improvements, and it doesn't need to be fancy. But I think that when people start to have this feeling that they are capable, that they can actually do more things than they thought they could, that has such a big effect on people in their entire life, not just their movement practice life, but like out on the street and deciding to do something new with a friend or going to a different type of class. Like it just helps expand people's lives in so many ways. And I think that oftentimes what the problem is with fitness and like conventional strength training is everyone is so focused on the looks and the aesthetics and the weight loss and the doing all these things and doing it all right. And no one is focused on the actual experience of the person who's doing the strength training or the fitness classes or whatever, and helping them do it in a way that builds their confidence so that they can go out in the world and feel like a more capable and resilient person. And I think that oftentimes people, at least the people I've worked with, are very hesitant to go to the gym or to go to a fitness class or to take up strength training, because all they see is this like fitness version that only cares about how lean you are or how heavy weights you can lift or what you look like. And they just feel like they'll never fit in there. That will never be able to work for them. And I think that if the fitness industry projected a little bit more of like, no, we're doing this training so that you can be a capable human and you can go out in the world and feel more resilient and like get down on the floor and stand back up and like move your fridge and just feel more empowered in your life, I think a lot more people would pick it up. And I think that the people who end up in my programs are really the people who just never thought they would be able to like do gym training or fitness training, or never thought they would enjoy that type of thing. And it's just been so wild to see how much people's confidence has grown. And then to get the emails, to hear the things that they've then signed up for, just simply because they've literally felt more empowered to do so.
Yeah. I mean, last year I've kind of done a deep dive in the mindset world, and it always comes back to embodying that, right? And people find that through movement. It's in that sense, it's a practice, but if they can physically feel stronger and see that in their day-to-day, it just builds confidence. And it's like a gradual mindset shift on what is possible and what, they could be doing that maybe they had never considered before, right?
100%. I think people really do need to feel it, because if you just like, you listen to your favorite song or your favorite motivational speaker and you get all like pumped up in your mind and motivated, and then you go to do something, like you go to like lift up a heavy box in your house, your body gives you feedback. And we're constantly just reacting to the feedback I think that our bodies are giving us. One of my mentors, Neil Pearson, he's a pain science researcher. in our last interview, he was like, the body is a sampling device, and it's sampling the environment. It's sampling the activities you do. It's sampling whatever you go through. And if a lot of those samples come back as like, I can't do this, that was too hard, I'm not in good enough shape, I'm whatever, like all the experiences, the thoughts that we have, if a lot of those start to come back to us, it doesn't matter how pumped up or how motivated we are, because our body is literally telling us something different. And so people will have different experiences with that. Some people are just going to override that and just go for it, which I don't know, maybe works for some people. I don't know. And then a lot of other people, and I think these are the people that I work with mostly who end up in my classes, is the people who are just like, I can't do this, or like, I can't do anything like this. That's not for me. This is not safe for me. That's not a good idea. And get a little bit more on the nervous end of the spectrum. And so I think that if we can help people through movement and mindful practices and all the things that we do in our classes actually feel like they have more capacity, then that's a great experience to cultivate in the confines of a class. But then, 3 weeks later, when they're at home and they're trying to do the thing, and their body is actually giving the feedback that, yes, you can do this, and this actually is safe for you, and you're going to be okay if you lift this box, or you do this thing, or you go play tennis, or you go for this hike with your friends, that's okay for you, then that's the experience that I think puts us up like another level of how much confidence we have. Because it's like, well, if I could do that, what else could I do? What else could I accomplish? But when we're constantly getting the sampling of like, I can't do this, this is hurting, this is dangerous for me, I think it constantly moves us down the ladder of how much confidence we have.
Yeah, for sure. Well, Kathryn, wrapping up, can you share with us some of your biggest takeaways or influences that you have, first from your mom, and then I want to hear like your reflection of your journey, because you've been in this a long time, and like you said, like what you're doing now looks a lot different than even 8 years ago, I'm sure. But thinking back to your roots in the Ashtangi world, what are some of the sort of more beautiful parts that you still carry?
I think, one of the best things I learned from all of those years doing that practice in that type of community is the benefits of actually having a practice. Because I think that people who engage in fitness don't often feel like they have a practice to do. And I think that with yoga and mindfulness, this feeling that I have a practice, and it's not always about a great workout, and it's not always going to feel good and amazing, but it is a practice that I consistently come back to, and I try to meet myself where I'm at. I think that has been one of the most powerful tools of the yoga practice that I've really taken forward, and that will continue to help me regardless of what type of movement I like to do at the time, because I'm sure that'll continue to change. And regardless of where I am or what my goals are, that feeling of like having a practice, having something that you just do for yourself and with yourself, I think is a pretty different mindset than I need to get this workout in, or like, I need to be able to do this now.
Yes, I love that you said that. It's so true. And I hadn't quite thought of it that way. There's a big difference between the discipline of committing to whatever your current workout regime or program is, to seeing it more as a personal tool. I love that you said that. Well, is there anything else you wanted to share with us? Of course, we'll leave all the links in the show notes to your membership and all the ways that people can stay connected with you. But any parting words?
I don't think so. I think that's it for today. Thank you so much for having me on the podcast. It's so interesting to be on like this side of the podcast experience.
Well, I'm sure it can't be their first podcast, but I know that you're usually the interviewer. I hope it was a good experience, and I'm so excited to share our conversation with people. I think your work is really important, and I've always loved what you're doing. So keep up the good work.
Thank you so much, Megan.
We'll leave it there. And we'll be sharing all of the links so you can connect with Kathryn and follow her on social media or sign up for her membership. So thank you so much for listening.